What does it take to get a film banned in 31 countries simultaneously? Not poor reviews, not a weak box office. Something considerably more specific. A filmmaker who understood exactly where the line was, crossed it deliberately, and then kept walking. The exploitation cinema of the 1970s and 1980s produced a category of film that the censorship apparatus of multiple governments found sufficient grounds to suppress. Not for political content, not for religious offense, but for the specific combination of violence, sexuality, and historical subject matter that the video nasties era defined as the outer boundary of what a paying audience could be permitted to receive. Different reasons a government decided its citizens needed protection from what was on the screen. 8 complete failures of that protection. Zombie Holocaust, 1980, directed by Marino Girolami. A series of corpse mutilations at a New York hospital leads a medical examiner and an anthropologist to a remote Indonesian island where the local population has developed a relationship with both cannibalism and the undead that the scientific framework the two investigators brought from Manhattan was not designed to account for. Marino Girolami made Zombie Holocaust, released in the United States as Dr. Butcher, M.D., a title that the American distributor Roy Frumkus marketed through a theatrical roadshow campaign involving a van decorated as a mobile operating theater parked outside New York City grindhouse theaters for Fulvia Film, and released it through the Italian exploitation market in 1980 before it entered international distribution through the regional deals that moved Italian genre content across borders. The film was made during the period when both the zombie cycle that Lucio Fulci's Zombie had established and the cannibal cycle that Cannibal Holocaust was simultaneously defining were at their commercial peaks, and Girolami's production strategy was to combine both cycles in a single film, not as parody, but as a genuine attempt to deliver twice the content at the same price point. The Ian McCulloch casting, bringing the lead actor from Fulci's Zombie into a film that was competing with Fulci's work in the same market, was the production's most commercially sophisticated decision, and the one that gave the film a credibility within the Italian exploitation ecosystem that its production values would not otherwise have earned. The Indonesian location shooting, actual footage of actual locations combined with studio work in Rome, gave the island sequences a physical authenticity that the budget's studio elements could not have provided alone. The operating theater sequence, the specific practical effects achievement that the Dr. Butcher, M.D. marketing campaign had been building toward across its entire roadshow campaign, delivered in the film's final act with the explicitness that the campaign had promised and that the censorship boards of the United Kingdom, Australia, and several other markets had determined was sufficient grounds for prohibition, was the content that the American grindhouse audience had been told to expect, and that the Dr. Butcher van parked outside the theater had been specifically advertising. The delivery matched the advertisement, which is a more reliable statement about Italian exploitation cinema of the period than most of its marketing deserved. Zombie Holocaust has been released through Shriek Show and Blue Underground in restorations that present the complete film. Marino Girolami made no further horror films. Roy Frumkus went on to direct the documentary Document of the Dead about George Romero, which has received considerably more critical attention than the film he roadshowed in a decorated van outside New York grindhouse theaters in 1980. The van has not been located. Love Camp 7, 1969. The film that started a genre nobody asked for. 2 American intelligence officers go undercover in a Nazi women's camp to extract a scientist, and R.L. Frost documented what happens inside the camp with a directness that the exploitation market of 1969 had not previously encountered in this specific subject matter. Bob Kress produced and co-wrote Love Camp 7 for Olympic International Films with a budget that the finished film's production values accurately reflect, and a marketing instinct that proved considerably more sophisticated than the production values suggested. First American production to combine the World War II women's prison camp setting with explicit exploitation content, a combination that European producers had been approaching from different angles since the early 1960s, and that Kress and Frost arrived at through the specific logic of the American grindhouse market, which had determined that the combination of historical atrocity and sexual content was commercially viable in ways that either element alone was not. In American grindhouse theaters, without significant regulatory interference, the specific legal frameworks that would have stopped it were not yet in place in 1969, and generated sufficient revenue to establish the Nazi exploitation subgenre as a commercially viable category that Italian producers developed across the following decade with considerably larger budgets and considerably more explicit content. Frost shot the camp sequences on a ranch in the San Fernando Valley that the production dressed with minimal period accuracy, and that the grindhouse audience received without complaint. The sequence in which the two undercover officers are processed into the camp, the specific bureaucratic texture of a system designed to dehumanize, rendered in a film that is itself engaged in a transaction the ethics of which the production never paused to consider, establishes the film's specific moral register in its first 15 minutes and maintains it without deviation to the end. Camp 7 has been released through Something Weird Video and exists as the founding document of a subgenre that its successors developed, amplified, and exported back to the American market through the Italian exploitation system. R.L. Frost directed several more exploitation films. Bob Cressy died in 1998. The San Fernando Valley Ranch has been developed. Experiment Camp, 1976. Female prisoners at a Nazi medical experimentation facility are subjected to procedures that the film documents with the specific combination of clinical detachment and exploitation content that the Italian genre market had developed across the preceding decade into a reliable commercial formula. Sergio Garrone made SS Experiment Camp for National Cinematografica and released it through the Italian distribution network before it entered the international exploitation market through regional deals that placed it in British video stores in the early 1980s, with the Director of Public Prosecutions added it to the Video Nasties list in 1983 and initiated seizure proceedings against distributors who had been stocking it without anticipating the regulatory response. The film belongs to the specific cycle of Italian Nazi exploitation that Love Camp 7 had established, and that Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, had developed into an internationally recognized commercial category. SS Experiment Camp arrived later in the cycle, when the category's conventions had been sufficiently established that the film's innovations were primarily in the direction of explicitness rather than concept. Garrone shot the camp setting on a soundstage in Rome with production design that achieved period plausibility at the budget level that Italian genre production of the period had standardized, and the practical effects work, medical experimentation sequences that the censorship boards across multiple markets found the most objectionable content in the film, was executed with the specific technical approach that the Italian exploitation industry had developed through the zombie and cannibal cycles of the same period. The transplant sequence in the film's final act, the specific medical procedure that the film presents as both the narrative's climax and its most explicit content, was the scene cited by the British DPP as the primary grounds for the seizure order, and it remains the sequence most discussed in the cult horror communities that have engaged with the film since its Video Nasties designation made it an object of collector interest. SS Experiment Camp has been released through Exploitation Digital and is available through specialty distributors. Sergio Garrone made one more exploitation film before leaving the genre. The Video Nasties designation was never formally removed. Forced Entry, 1975. Directed by Jim Sotos. A gas station attendant in New York City uses his access to customers' addresses to follow women home and assault them, and Jim Sotos filmed the assaults with a documentary directness that the regional distribution network moved through the American grindhouse circuit until the seizures began accumulating faster than the distribution strategy could accommodate. Jim Sotos made Forced Entry for Harry Novak's Box Office International Pictures and released it through the regional exploitation network in 1975 where it encountered the specific legal environment that the post-Miller versus obscenity framework had produced, in which local prosecutors had sufficient latitude to initiate seizures based on community standards that varied significantly between jurisdictions. The film was seized in multiple American cities through proceedings that the distributor contested with varying success depending on the jurisdiction and the specific content that the local prosecutor had cited as the grounds for the action. Tanya Roberts, before her roles in Charlie's Angels and The Beastmaster, established her mainstream profile, appears in the film in one of her earliest screen appearances, a biographical detail that the film's subsequent cult reputation has attached to without the mainstream accounts of her career acknowledging.
The New York City location shooting, conducted on actual streets and in actual residential buildings, without the permits or community awareness that a legitimate production would have required, gives the film the specific documentary texture that the Grindhouse audience responded to, and that the prosecutors found most objectionable. The sense that what was being filmed was happening in the real city, rather than in a constructed approximation of it.
The sequence in which the attendant selects his next victim from the customer records, the specific banality of a filing system being used for a purpose its designers had not anticipated, was the scene most cited by the critics who engaged seriously with the film's relationship to real violence, as the moment that distinguished Forced Entry from the exploitation films that surrounded it in the Grindhouse circuit. Forced Entry has been released through Something Weird Video and is available through specialty distributors. Jim Sotos directed several more exploitation films before leaving the industry. Tanya Roberts' involvement has been acknowledged in retrospective interviews without the film being discussed in any detail. The Box Office International Pictures Archive has not been formally preserved. Shocking Asia, 1974, directed by Rolf Olsen. A German production crew travels through Asia documenting practices, rituals, and social phenomena that the Western audience the film was made for had not seen presented in this format, without the anthropological framing that legitimizing institutions required, and without the editorial distance that the documentary tradition had developed to manage audience response to difficult content. Rolf Olsen made Shocking Asia for Lisa Film and released it through the European exploitation market before it entered international distribution through the regional deals that moved Mondo content across borders in the mid-1970s. The film belongs to the tradition that Mondo Cane had established in 1962 and that the Italian exploitation market had developed through the following decade into a recognized commercial category. Shocking Asia arrived with the specific advantage of Asian locations that the Italian Mondo productions had not systematically covered, and with a German production sensibility that brought a different formal approach to the material. The footage the film compiled, from locations across Japan, India, Thailand, and the Philippines, included material that several of the countries depicted subsequently objected to on grounds that ranged from cultural misrepresentation to violation of the dignity of the people filmed, objections that the film's distributor received and filed without modifying the distribution strategy. The American market received the film through the same regional exploitation network that had moved Mondo Cane and its successors, where it played in theaters that had developed the specific legal and commercial arrangements necessary for content that the mainstream distribution infrastructure would not handle. The sequences involving religious and funerary practices, filmed without the consent of the communities depicted and presented with a narration that the communities would not have recognized as an accurate account of what was being shown, were the content that produced the most sustained international objection and that several governments cited as the grounds for restricting the film's distribution within their territories. Shocking Asia has been released through Severin Films and is available through specialty distributors. A sequel was produced in 1985. Rolf Olsen continued directing in the German market. The communities depicted in the film were not consulted about the restoration. The Beast in Heat, 1977, directed by Luigi Bazzella. A Nazi scientist creates a bestial humanoid creature through genetic experimentation
and uses it as an instrument of punishment against prisoners in a wartime camp. And Luigi Batzella filmed the creature's interactions with the prisoners with an explicitness that the exploitation market had not yet established as standard practice, even within the Nazi exploitation subgenre that Love Camp 7 had founded 8 years earlier. Luigi Batzella made The Beast in Heat, released under multiple alternate titles, including Horrifying Experiments of the SS Last Days and SS Hell Camp, for a budget that the production's technical limitations accurately reflect, and a commercial ambition that exceeded those limitations in ways that the finished film makes visible. The film arrived in the international exploitation market through the regional distribution network that had been moving Nazi exploitation content since the early 1970s, and it encountered censorship responses in the United Kingdom, Australia, and several continental European markets that were more severe than the responses the subgenre's previous entries had produced. Not because the film was categorically different from its predecessors, but because it combined the subgenre's established conventions with creature horror elements that the censorship frameworks had not previously been required to address in combination. The practical creature effects, achieved on a budget that required significant creative compromise, and that the compromise made more rather than less disturbing in the specific way that imperfect practical effects can be more unsettling than polished ones, were the content that the censorship boards found most objectionable, cited in multiple suppression orders as the specific grounds for the prohibition. The sequence in which the creature is introduced to the camp's prisoners, the staging, the specific quality of what Batzella was asking his practical effects team to achieve within the constraints they were working under, was the image most consistently cited by the exploitation audience as the one that established The Beast in Heat as an outlier, even within a subgenre that had already established extreme content as its baseline. The Beast in Heat has been released through Exploitation Digital and is available through specialty distributors. Luigi Batzella made no further exploitation films. The subgenre he contributed to declined rapidly in the early 1980s as the video nasties enforcement made distribution increasingly difficult. The creature suit used in the film has not been located. Absurd, 1981, directed by Joe D'Amato. A man with a regenerative ability that prevents him from dying from his injuries escapes from a priest who has been pursuing him across Europe and arrives in a small American town where he begins working through the available population with a patience and a thoroughness that the local sheriff's department finds difficult to address through conventional policing methods. Joe D'Amato made Absurd, released under the alternate titles Anthropophagus 2 and Monster Hunter, for Filmirage, and released it through the international exploitation market in 1981, where it entered the British VHS market and was immediately placed on the Video Nasties list by the Director of Public Prosecutions. D'Amato had made Anthropophagus the previous year and understood that the Video Nasties designation had become a commercial instrument as well as a regulatory one. The ban generated the collector demand that the legitimate market could not satisfy, and the underground distribution network that had developed to move banned content moved Absurd through the British market with the efficiency that prohibition reliably produces. The American slasher conventions that D'Amato incorporated into the film's structure, the suburban setting, the babysitter and children in an isolated house, the unstoppable killer working through the location, were grafted onto the supernatural regeneration premise with the specific pragmatism of an Italian genre filmmaker who understood the American market's preferences and had a production infrastructure capable of delivering them at a price point the distribution deals could support. The head vice sequence, the specific practical effects achievement that the British censorship board cited as the primary grounds for the Video Nasties designation, was constructed by D'Amato's effects team with materials and techniques that the production's budget constrained, and that the constraint made more rather than less effective in the specific way that practical effects achieve when the viewer's imagination is doing more work than the mechanism. Absurd has been released through Shriek Show and is available through specialty distributors and streaming. Joe D'Amato made over 200 films across his career under multiple pseudonyms. Absurd is the one that the Video Nasties designation
made most enduringly visible. D'Amato died in 1999. The regeneration premise has since appeared in approximately 40 mainstream films, none of which acknowledge the source.
Films that the censorship apparatus of multiple governments decided their citizens could not be trusted to watch, and that every citizen who wanted to watch them eventually watched anyway, through grindhouse circuits, through VHS networks, through the specific infrastructure that prohibition reliably builds for the content it is trying to suppress. The ban was the reason the van decorated as a mobile operating theater parked outside a New York grindhouse theater drew a line around the block. None of these films needed a marketing budget. They had something more reliable. A government telling the audience they were not allowed to see them. Which country's ban surprised you most? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe. Next time we go into the films that the censors almost stopped and didn't, and what got through in the version that survived.